I'm doing this video on the Honda EU1000 rebuild because I've seen several of the rebuilds on the EU2000s, and I've only seen one on the EU1000. They tore it down to the engine, but they didn't show a rebuild of the engine. So that can be found on YouTube, and even tearing down the EU2000 is similar to the EU1000 until you get to the engine. Of course, the 1000, this 50cc engine is an overhead valve, where the EU2000 100cc engine is an overhead cam with a timing belt. So anyway, I'm down to the engine, and I'll be tearing this apart today, but some review before I start doing that. This is the cover for the camshaft to access the cam. And these bolts here that hold this cover on, the book only specifies that they be torqued in a crisscross pattern, and the torque on this is 5.4 foot-pounds. Now on the other side, this is the sump cover, and this is where we access the piston and crank. And there is a pattern on this for the sump cover, and the torque on there for the sump cover is 5.4 foot-pounds. Now the rotor or flywheel, the torque on there is 20 foot-pounds. The connecting rod caps for the piston on the connecting rod, those are 4.4 foot-pounds. And there's a pulse generator which triggers the ignition that goes on the flywheel, and that the gap on that is 0.4 to 0.6 millimeters, or 16 thousandths to 23 thousandths of an inch. And the torque on that bolt is 4.4 pounds. And when installing the piston, the arrow, there's an arrow on top of the piston, and that goes toward the intake side. This is the intake side. And this is the exhaust. And I'll tear this down and continue with the video of it after I get it torn apart. Oil level sensor. The ground goes to the single bolt, opposite of the two together. So I've got the cam cover off, and the valve cover. One of the push rods fell out with the rocker, or the cam follower. And on the cover, there's the oil slinger. And this cam has a governor that reduces compression for ease of starting. And then once it starts, it sets the timing just for normal operation. Now these covers, this cam cover and the sump cover on the other side, there's no gasket. They'll be sealed up with this Honda bond. And on another note, I've got the piston rings, and they're only available in standard size. There's no oversize on these. So you can't put in a larger piston. And on the valves, there is only one valve guide seal, and that's on the intake. So I'm going to, I spent just under $100. I've got the rings, the valve guide seal, and I'm going to go ahead and replace the fuel hoses because this unit is over 20 years old. I've had this unit for a while, and I bought it used. I was told it had low hours on it, but you know how that goes. And when I got it home, I changed the oil. The oil was black, but it ran fine. And I've had it probably 12, 15 years now, and I myself have over 1,300 hours on it. But it started to use some oil and foul the plug. The the interval on the plug is 300 hours, but I was finding that it wouldn't go more than 200 hours on the plug without getting fouled up with carbon and from the burning of the oil. Anyway, and so I had some tools here to do all the service on this. One thing I did have to get was something to hold the flywheel, a strap that went around there so I can get the crank bolt loose to get the flywheel off. So this is the sump cover off, so this exposes the connecting rod and the crankshaft and the piston. There's the camshaft with its single lobe, which operates both valves. I'll be taking a measurement of the height on that and checking it according to the book specs to see if I need to get a new cam, since it's so easy to do. And I didn't give the full list of the seals, but yeah, the crank seal, which goes on this cover, the sump cover, will be replaced. There's an O-ring on the oil level sensor, which is on the bottom of the engine. And all the fuel hoses, the valve guide seal, and it looks like all the gaskets, like for the carburetor and the exhaust, those were still good, so I'll reuse those. And I think there was one other seal somewhere. Can't remember where that was. Maybe I'll remember this. When I get to the next segment. So I'm going to take the piston out now. And one thing I do want to check is the ring position on the piston when I take it out, because there's... So I have everything completely torn down. The piston is out, the valves are out. And today I worked on cleaning up the surfaces of the sump cover, the cam cover, the cylinder block surface, and I worked on the piston. And I cleaned it up and tried to put more of a polish on it. I sanded it down with 1500 and 2000 grit. I understand that the smoother you can get this surface, the less opportunity the carbon wants to stick to this. So I did that and got that all cleaned up. The ring grooves look good. The oil passages are clear. I did hone the cylinder. Have that done. I put some valve grinding compound on the valves and lapped them a little bit just to make sure they were clear from any carbon that was up in there. I do have to clean the carbon off of this exhaust valve. And I found it unusual that this engine, which is supposed to only have a valve guide seal on the intake, which is on this side, there was no valve guide seal. And this is what it should look like, and it sits over that ridge that is the valve guide, and I fitted it and it's correct. So it makes me wonder if this was rebuilt before or had some kind of issue. So maybe that was part of the reason why it was consuming some oil. So I have this going back together, and the piston's in, the crank is in, and the sump cover, which is on the other side, is in. That's where you access the piston. So I have to put this cam cover on. I was going to point out where the timing marks are on the cam. Here's a mark, and then it's hard to see, but right here, a dot on the crank gear, and just line those up for the proper timing. Anyway, some more follow-up on this engine. I purchased it in January of 2010, and it apparently was sold new in December of 2000. And if you buy any Honda engine, you can contact their power equipment department and give them the serial number, and they will tell you when the warranty date started, which was when it was originally sold new. And the warranty on them was normally 3 years. So it was 9 years old when I purchased it. And so I can't, some other things with this engine, like I said, the valve guide seal on the intake was missing when I opened it up. And also underneath on the other side, the sump cover, there's supposed to be a breather filter that had this material in it. It was missing, so I had to order some and cut a piece to fit in there for the breather tube, the breather filter. And so that was strange. I don't know if it had some kind of failure warranty job, or just Honda left these parts out when they put it together. I can't believe that happened. I don't imagine these EU1000s get used a whole lot, not like the 2000s. So I don't know if it was it was obviously, like I said earlier, when I got it, the oil was black, but it ran pretty good. And the other thing I had to do when I had it apart, the exhaust valve was, the seating surface was pitted, so I put a new exhaust valve in it. But I did notice the exhaust valve did have a new part number, which usually means it's an updated part, that because it probably had some issue before in the previous valves that were installed. So I installed an upgraded or updated part on the exhaust valve. And so we got the cam timing. So the gap on the valves, the intake is 0.06 to 0.10 millimeters, or 2/1000 to 4/1000 of an inch. That's on the intake. And the exhaust is 0.09 millimeters to 0.13 millimeters, or 4/1000 to 5/1000 of an inch. And on the ring gap positioning for the piston rings, all the ring gaps are 120 degrees apart. And so I have as according to the service manual, they don't want you to line them up with the gaps with the piston pin on either side. So the two compression rings are on one side of the piston, close to the piston pins on either side, but not directly over it. So that's the first 120, and then that ends up for the oil control ring is right over the piston skirt on the other side, which gives everything a 120 degree gap. And speaking of the breather tube, there is a breather tube that goes in right here. And as I mentioned before, I ordered all the fuel lines. And when I took the breather tube out, I found that where it slips in here, it doesn't have any clamp or anything. It just slips in there, and then the shielding that goes over this side of the engine holds it in. But anyway, I found out the rubber was brittle and cracking, probably because of the heat, so I had to order that. And that's actually back ordered, so they're sending it from the Honda warehouse to the Honda supply outfit that I ordered it from. So I can get as far as that, get all this together, and then I have to wait for the breather tube. Removing the rocker arms and the valves is pretty easy once you do have the piston out, the crank and the piston and the sump cover. This pin just slides right out and the rockers come out. and then you can put a wooden handle of a hammer up inside the cylinder and hold the valves closed. And all you need to do once you're holding the valves closed is just press down on this keeper. And there's a hole there. If you just push down, hold the valve in place, push down on this retainer, slide it over, and the spring will come off. And here's where you make the adjustments for the valves once everything is installed. And here's the strap wrench to hold the rotor so you can loosen the nut or tighten it for removal of the rotor. So when I had this all apart, I took measurements of different items that I could easily measure with the tools I had. And I measured the valve spring length, both the intake and exhaust, and they were under spec. The minimum is 900 thousandths of an inch, and mine were at 897 thousandths of an inch, so they were 3 thousandths under spec, and 3 thousandths of an inch under spec. And I thought I would just go ahead and run them, but I had to order, like I said earlier in a video, the breather tube, which is on back order. So I thought, well, I can go ahead and change these springs since I'm waiting for the breather tube. But now I have the engine together, and you would normally have to access the valve to hold it in place while compressing these valve springs, which are easy to compress by hand if they're held from underneath. So since it's all together, I thought if I just take this smaller size nylon rope that I could fit in the spark plug hole. So I backed off the flywheel from top dead center about 1/4 of the way down, filled the cylinder with the rope, and then brought the flywheel up until it fit tight just against the valve. And I can compress these enough to get the retainer off. So I'm not going to take them off now because I'm still waiting for the valve springs, but that's what I'll do when they come. This is on the compression stroke, so both valves are closed. You wouldn't want to do this when the one of the valves were open, so you want to make sure it's on the compression stroke and top dead center before you put this rope in, so you can access at least the springs and the valve guide seal if you wanted to replace that without taking the engine apart. And so that's what I'm going to be doing on this.